Erwin Rommel, nicknamed the Desert Fox. Possibly the most emblematic and famous German general of World War II. His main actions were the direction of the 7th Panzer Division that crossed France at lightning speed, the direction of the Italo-German forces in North Africa, and the defense of Normandy. Among all of them, it is precisely his action in the African theater that is most striking, and the one that gave him the fame he has today. In any case, and as always happens when a person is mythologized, there are many things that are said about him that are not entirely true. So, the questions that today's program brings us are the following. Is it true that Rommel was abandoned in North Africa to his fate? Was Rommel fighting in a secondary arena to which no priority was given? Well, this is exactly what we are going to analyze next. The first thing that we have to be clear about is the orders with which Rommel was sent to North Africa at the beginning of 1941. Basically, he had been ordered to defend Tripolitania, and to do what he considered best to do so. Rommel wasted no time and quickly began planning an offensive, without taking into account the logistical needs that this action would cause. So when he communicated it to the German High Command, they denied him permission. At that time, finding ourselves at the end of March 1941, Rommel had at his disposal some 150 tanks, half being Panzer I and Panzer II, plus other units of the Italian army. What Rommel did next was start a series of skirmishes around El Agheila, until he forced a major attack on Cyrenaica. After all, he was not disobeying the orders received, because in his freedom as a German general, he considered that the best defense for Tripolitania was to move the new front line a few hundred kilometers to the east. This offensive managed to widely defeat the British, and allowed the Germans to conquer the port of Benghazi, and reach Tobruk. With this, Rommel greatly extended his supply line, but he was able to keep up with a lot of effort. In these months of April and May 1941, the Germans were a few weeks away from launching their great offensive against the Soviet Union, and they could not take charge of the new scenario that Rommel had decided to create in North Africa, which every day needed more and more supplies. And it is that, and to give us an idea, the Afrika Korps needed some 70,000 tons of supplies per month, which makes a total of 2,300 per day. At this point, we have to remember that the war in the desert requires a total motorization of the units that fight in it, and that is why the supply needs are so great. Gasoline, ammunition, vehicles, water, and supplies of all kinds are needed in large quantities, making fighting on foot practically impossible. In any case, let's go back to the previous point, this being the great operation that the Germans were preparing in the Soviet Union. This was the one that truly required all German attention, but Rommel and his Afrika Korps were not neglected for this. Paulus himself had to pay a visit to Rommel at the end of April, on behalf of the German High Command, to order him not to continue advancing further and to limit himself solely to holding the conquered territory. So, after spending a few days in Africa, Paulus sent a telegram to Halder telling him that Rommel had created a situation in which it was impossible to continue sending him the supplies he needed, and that the German general was not up to the task. Other opinions that Paulus later said of Rommel were that he was a stubborn person who did not listen to reason, an unconscious person, and someone who liked to be surrounded by photographers all the time. Paulus said that this way of acting that Rommel had was responsible for having brought his units to the brink of total collapse. Given this, let's continue giving some very important data, which will clarify to a large extent whether Rommel was neglected, and whether the African front remained as a secondary sector. In the first place, it should be noted that Rommel had more than 6,000 trucks to be able to supply his 3 divisions, which gives us an average of about 2,000 for each one. Although it had initially been estimated that each Rommel division would need around 1,200 trucks, after expanding the distance to the supply ports, more trucks were needed per division. To see it in a comparative way, it must be noted that during Operation Barbarossa the 190 German divisions that participated in it had some 33,000 trucks assigned. This leads us to the fact that while each of Rommel's divisions needed between 2,000 and 1,600 trucks, those that attacked the Soviets would do so with about 170 each. To this, we must also add all the transport to Italy and later by sea to Tripoli, Benghazi, or finally Tobruk. During the summer of 1942, this being the moment in which it had advanced further east, some 45,000 tons a month could be unloaded in the port of Tripoli, and in that of Benghazi and Tobruk about 20,000 tons in each of them. However, these last two ports were closer to Egypt and were bombarded non-stop. Thus, a truck leaving from the port of Tripoli had to travel about 3,500 kilometers between the outward journey and the return journey, at the time of Rommel's greatest expansion. This leads to the anecdote that the truck needed the same gasoline to make that journey that it could transport for the front-line units. In a few words and by way of summary, although the Germans continued to send supplies to North Africa, there came a point where it was practically impossible to get them to Rommel to the combat zones. In addition, and no less important, Germany and Italy were countries with very limited resources, and although countries like the Soviet Union or the United States could have maintained this continuous waste of supplies, this was not the case with the Axis powers, although they certainly were. After seeing this issue, let us now move on to the second of the program, this being the number of tanks that Rommel received during each month of his campaign in Africa. In total, it is estimated that he received close to 1,400 battle tanks, this being a tremendously high number. It should be noted that during the Battle of Normandy, this being an absolute priority for the Germans had some 1,900 tanks, without the added difficulty of having the Mediterranean Sea in the middle, and thousands of kilometers away. Thus, we can see that at no time was the African theater abandoned, despite the enormous demands that the Eastern Front began to have from the summer of 1941. In this table we can see the shipments of tanks that Rommel received during 1942, and we see precisely how in the months of January and February, he received 156 Panzer III and 40 Panzer IV, while the German front in Russia was reeling. To this we must add a shipment made during the month of December 1941 with 11 Panzer III and 34 Panzer IV, that unfortunately for them were completely lost when the convoy was sunk. Later, during the harsh months of November and December 1942, when the Soviets launched their major offensives along the entire Eastern Front, Rommel once again received large shipments of 141 Panzer IIIs and 22 Panzer IV. In addition to the great effort was made to send 20 of the first Tigers to Africa, giving priority to this scenario over the Eastern Front. After having analyzed these data, we can estimate that Rommel was never abandoned in Africa, nor was the African front left aside. Everything the Germans and Italians were able to deliver was sent to him, but the difficult terrain conditions, Rommel's continued improvisation and defiance of orders, and Allied material superiority, made it impossible for the Desert Fox to carry out its purpose. Despite all these difficulties, Rommel came very close to reaching Cairo, and therefore the Suez Canal, and without a doubt these actions, together with both Allied and German war propaganda, have been what have made him mythologized so much. Today, since we know the result of the war, it is easy to say, but one of the most effective ways to have developed this campaign with greater guarantees would have been to conquer Malta and Gibraltar. With this, Rommel's supply line would have been much stronger and more secure, and it is very possible that everything that the stubborn Marshal needed to take Egypt could have been delivered to him. But, what do you think? Would you consider that if it was abandoned and treated as a secondary front that was not given attention? I leave you in the description the great program we did with Antonio Munoz about this campaign in the African desert, which has more than 120,000 visits. Thank you all so much for being part of this community, especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and see you next Thursday and Sunday. See you soon.